Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere quiet and slow, the kind of place where the loudest sound is usually a reed pen scratching gently across papyrus. So if you're getting ready for sleep, this is a good moment to dim the lights, relax your shoulders, and let your brain drift as we wander back more than 2,000 years to the Mediterranean coast and a city that once held the largest collection of knowledge in the ancient world, the city of Alexandria. Alexandria itself was not exactly peaceful. The harbor was full of shouting sailors, merchants bargaining loudly, philosophers debating endlessly. And somewhere nearby there was almost always a donkey complaining about life. But inside the royal quarter of the city, there was a much calmer place filled with scrolls, quiet scholars, and the slow, careful work of organizing knowledge. And that place was the famous Library of Alexandria. The city had originally been founded by Alexander the Great, a man who conquered enormous territories before most people his age had even figured out their career plans. And while traveling through Egypt around 331 BC, he decided to establish a new city on the Mediterranean coast and, naturally, named it after himself, because when you conquer half the world, that sort of thing apparently feels reasonable. After Alexander died young, his empire was divided among his generals, and Egypt ended up ruled by Ptolemy I. Soter, a practical and ambitious man, who looked at Alexandria and thought it could become something more than just another port city. He wanted it to become the intellectual center of the world. So Ptolemy funded an institution called the Mauseon, which literally meant the place of the muses, and it functioned like an ancient research center where scholars lived, studied, debated ideas, and spent large portions of their lives arguing politely but stubbornly about mathematics, poetry, astronomy, and grammar. Attached to the Mauseon was the library, and that is where our quiet librarian spends his days, surrounded by scrolls, dust, ink, and the surprisingly complicated task of organizing knowledge. Unlike modern libraries, there were no books with neat spines sitting on shelves. Instead, the library stored papyrus scrolls, long sheets of papyrus rolled tightly and tied with small tags identifying their contents. And these scrolls held everything from epic poetry and philosophy to astronomy charts and medical texts that sometimes offered brilliant insight and sometimes suggested remedies involving honey onions and a hopeful attitude. Every scroll had to be copied by hand, which meant rows of scribes sitting at desks, slowly writing line after line using reed pens dipped in ink. And the sound of those pens scratching across papyrus probably formed the background music of the library as daily life. Our librarian likely arrives early in the morning when the Mediterranean sun begins lighting. The harbor and the giant lighthouse of Alexandria stands tall in the distance, one of the most famous structures of the ancient world, guiding ships safely into port. But after seeing it every day, even a world wonder eventually becomes just another part of the skyline. So our librarian walks past it without much thought and heads toward the quiet halls of the Mauseon. Inside the library, the day begins with routine work because a massive collection of scrolls requires careful organization or everything would quickly become chaos. And one of the scholars associated with this effort was Callimachus, who created one of the earliest catalog systems known in history, a massive index of authors and works, called the Pinax, which attempted to classify thousands of scrolls by subject, author, and genre. Our librarian spends much of his time dealing with this system, checking which scrolls belong in which section, confirming authors, and sometimes listening to scholars argue endlessly about whether a particular text was authentic or a clever imitation written by someone hoping to borrow the prestige of a famous name. Scrolls constantly arrived in Alexandria because the Ptolemaic rulers had a very aggressive policy for acquiring books. Any ship entering the harbor might be searched for texts, and if scrolls were found, they were temporarily taken to the library so scribes could copy them. Though occasionally the original copies mysteriously stayed in Alexandria, while the ship owners received the freshly copied versions instead, which was a polite scholarly way of saying the library sometimes kept the better edition. For our librarian, this means new work every week because every shipment must be cataloged, sorted, and sometimes repaired. If the papyrus has been damaged by travel, humidity, or careless handling, and Papyrus is delicate enough that preserving it requires patience and constant attention. Meanwhile, the scholars of the Mausian move quietly through the halls, debating ideas that might seem strangely specific to modern ears. One scholar may insist a poem belongs to Homer, while another calmly explains that the vocabulary suggests a later writer imitating Homer is style, and soon 3 or 4 more scholars join the conversation until the discussion becomes an elaborate analysis of grammar that lasts longer than lunch. Our librarian hears these debates often and usually nods politely while focusing on practical matters, like shelf space, because storing thousands of scrolls requires careful planning. Scrolls must be grouped by subject, labeled properly, and protected from moisture or rodents that would happily chew through centuries of literature without any appreciation for cultural heritage. The routine repeats day after day. Scribes copy texts, scholars debate authorship, and the librarian quietly moves through the stacks, ensuring each scroll returns to its correct place. Outside the walls of the library, Alexandria remains noisy and chaotic, with markets, temples, and political discussions filling the streets. But inside the library, the atmosphere remains calm and deliberate, a steady rhythm of scholarship that preserves ideas from across the Mediterranean world. The librarian himself will probably never become famous. There will be no statues honoring his careful cataloging work, and historians will rarely mention his name. But without people performing this quiet routine, much of ancient knowledge might have vanished long ago. As the afternoon light fades through the halls, our librarian finishes another small task, tying a tag around a newly copied scroll and placing it carefully into its proper place in the catalog, another piece of knowledge safely stored among thousands of others. The scribes continue writing slowly while scholars wander through the aisles searching for references that might settle their arguments. And somewhere nearby, a philosopher begins explaining a complicated idea to a colleague who politely pretends to understand. Evening eventually arrives over Alexandria. Ships settle in the harbor. The lighthouse prepares to light its flame, and the library grows quiet as the day's work ends. Our librarian takes one last look at the orderly rows of scrolls before leaving, satisfied that everything is exactly where it should be, because tomorrow morning he will return to repeat the same calm routine again. Another day spent quietly protecting the written memory of the ancient world, one scroll at a time. The next morning arrives in much the same way the previous one did, because ancient librarians rarely experience dramatic plot twists before breakfast, and our librarian wakes as the first sunlight creeps across the rooftops of Alexandria, while the harbor slowly fills with the everyday noise of sailors shouting instructions and merchants preparing for another long day of business. And somewhere out on the water, fishermen are already pulling in nets while arguing about whose catch will be larger, even though everyone knows the sea will decide that question on its own. Our librarian walks the familiar route toward the Royal District, passing vendors setting up stalls and students hurrying along while reading scrolls, occasionally bumping into things, because reading while walking has never been a safe activity in any century. And eventually the great buildings of the Mausian appear ahead, calm and orderly, compared with the lively chaos of the city beyond. The Library of Alexandria is already awake when he arrives, because scribes tend to begin early, their desks arranged in long rows, where papyrus sheets lie unrolled across wooden surfaces while reed pens move slowly and carefully, copying line after line with patience that modern people might find almost unbelievable. Though if your job involves preserving knowledge for future generations, you probably learn to appreciate steady, quiet work rather quickly. Our librarian pauses for a moment before beginning his tasks, because there is something comforting about the smell of fresh ink and papyrus, a scent that probably filled these halls every day for generations. And then he begins checking the catalog again, because when thousands of scrolls exist in one building, it only takes a single misplaced tag for confusion to begin spreading quietly through the stacks. Cataloging is not glamorous work, but it is deeply satisfying to the sort of person who enjoys order, and our librarian carefully checks the entries associated with the system originally created by scholars like Callimachus, whose massive catalog attempted to list authors, titles, and subjects, so future scholars would not wander the library halls for hours searching for the one scroll they actually needed. As he works, he occasionally overhears fragments of conversation from nearby scholars, because the Mausian is full of people who love discussing ideas, sometimes calmly, and sometimes with the determined seriousness of people who have spent decades thinking about a single topic. And today one group seems deeply involved in discussing the mathematical writings of Euclid, who once worked in Alexandria, and whose geometric ideas were already becoming legendary among students who appreciated straight lines, angles, and proofs that seemed almost magically logical. Our librarian listens quietly for a moment while adjusting a bundle of scrolls, because mathematicians tend to sound extremely confident when discussing triangles. But eventually he returns to his work, because scrolls still need organizing regardless of how elegant geometry might be. Not long after the morning begins, a messenger arrives from the harbor, carrying a small bundle wrapped carefully in cloth. And everyone in the library immediately understands what this means, because new texts arriving in Alexandria are always a significant event, even if they appear quietly and without ceremony. The bundle is opened slowly, and inside are several scrolls brought by a merchant ship from Athens, and the titles suggest philosophical works connected to the teachings of Aristotle, whose writings have already influenced scholars across the Mediterranean world. The scribes gather around with calm interest, because every new text represents another opportunity for copying, studying, and eventually debating endlessly over small details of wording that may or may not change the meaning of an entire argument. Our librarian carefully records the arrival in the catalog, noting the origin of the texts and assigning them temporary storage while scribes prepare to copy them onto fresh papyrus. And this is the sort of quiet administrative work that keeps the entire intellectual machine of Alexandria functioning smoothly. The copying process itself takes hours, because scribes must work slowly to avoid mistakes, dipping their reed pens into ink while reading each line aloud under their breath before transferring the words onto new sheets. And the room fills with a gentle murmur of voices quietly repeating sentences, as if the building itself is softly reciting philosophy. Meanwhile, scholars wander past, asking questions about the new arrivals, wondering whether the texts contain unknown commentaries or alternative interpretations. And our librarian politely answers as best he can while keeping track of which scrolls belong where, because scholars have a remarkable talent for leaving scrolls in unusual places after reading them. Outside the windows, Alexandria continues its busy routine, with ships docking and traders negotiating prices. But inside the library, time moves differently, measured not by commerce but by the slow completion of copied pages and the steady growth of knowledge preserved on papyrus. Around midday, the scholars gather for meals within the Mausian, where discussions continue even while eating, because philosophers rarely stop analyzing ideas simply because food has arrived. And someone inevitably brings up the astronomical theories of Aristarchus of Samos, who once proposed the rather bold suggestion that the Earth might actually revolve around the Sun, an idea that sounds surprisingly modern but at the time seemed almost too strange to accept easily. Our librarian hears this debate while passing through the hall, carrying a small stack of scrolls that need repairing, because papyrus occasionally splits along the edges after years of use, and repairing scrolls requires patience, thin strips of fresh papyrus, and careful hands. After lunch, the copying continues, the scribes slowly producing duplicates that will remain in the library archives, while the originals might someday return to their owners, or perhaps quietly remain in Alexandria if the Ptolemaic rulers decide the texts are too valuable to lose. This policy of collecting knowledge from ships has given Alexandria an enormous advantage over other cities, because texts from across the Greek world and beyond eventually pass through these halls, and our librarian sometimes pauses to think about how strange it is that ideas from distant lands all gather here like travelers meeting at a crossroads. Late in the afternoon, a young student enters, searching nervously for a specific scroll about medicine attributed to Hippocrates, and the librarian guides him gently toward the correct section, because students always seem slightly overwhelmed by the sheer number of texts surrounding them. And seeing someone discover the right scroll among thousands provides a quiet sense of accomplishment that rarely appears in heroic legends, but matters greatly to people who care about knowledge. As the day slowly winds down, the scribes finish their final lines of copying, while scholars drift away from their discussions, still arguing softly about philosophical details that will likely continue tomorrow, and our librarian completes his final catalog notes before walking through the aisles once more to ensure every scroll is safely returned to its place. Outside, the sky over Alexandria turns warm with evening light, while the harbor prepares for night and the famous lighthouse begins to glow again above the water, guiding ships safely toward shore, while inside the library, the scrolls rest quietly on their shelves, waiting for another day of careful attention. Our librarian leaves the building calmly, knowing that tomorrow will likely unfold in much the same way. Another peaceful cycle of organization, copying, and scholarly debate. And honestly, that steady routine might be exactly what allows the Library of Alexandria to grow into the most remarkable center of learning in the ancient world, one quiet day and one carefully placed scroll at a time. The following morning arrives with the same calm rhythm that has quietly guided Alexandria for years, and our librarian wakes once again as the early sunlight stretches across the Mediterranean water and slowly warms the stone streets of the city, because ancient cities tend to wake early whether people feel ready or not, and Alexandria is no exception. Sailors are already hauling ropes along the harbor docks. Merchants are setting up their stalls with baskets of grain, fruit, and spices. And somewhere in the distance, a philosopher has likely already begun explaining something extremely complicated to a friend who only wanted to buy bread, but now finds himself trapped in a lecture about metaphysics. Our librarian walks the familiar path toward the royal quarter, passing statues, temples, and rows of white buildings that reflect the morning sun so brightly that travelers arriving by sea must have thought the city looked almost like a glowing mirage rising from the coast. Eventually, he reaches the quiet halls of the Library of Alexandria again, the scholarly sanctuary founded long ago under the patronage of rulers like Ptolemy, the first Soter, who believed that collecting knowledge could strengthen a kingdom just as much as collecting soldiers. Inside the library, the air is cool and still, and rows of scrolls rest peacefully on their shelves while scribes prepare their desks for another day of copying text that might survive centuries if handled carefully. Our librarian begins the morning by reviewing a small pile of scrolls that arrived the previous afternoon, because new texts always require attention before they are fully absorbed into the vast catalog system that scholars rely on when searching for information among thousands of writings. Some scrolls contain poetry, some contain philosophical debates, and one appears to be a commentary on the plays of Sophocles, whose dramatic works were already considered classics long before our librarian ever began his quiet career among the shelves. As he reads the title tags, he gently adjusts their placement, because even a small error in labeling could cause endless confusion later when a scholar desperately searches for a reference and discovers the scroll has wandered into the wrong section. The work might seem repetitive, but there is something almost meditative about the steady rhythm of organization, and our librarian has learned that patience is the most valuable skill in a building filled with fragile knowledge. Across the hall, several scholars are already engaged in a discussion about geography, inspired by the writings of Eratosthenes, who once served as chief librarian of Alexandria and famously calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than shadows, measurements, and careful reasoning. The scholars are debating how such measurements might influence maps used by sailors and merchants, and although their conversation remains calm, it carries the quiet excitement of people realizing that the world might be larger and more complex than previously imagined. Our librarian hears parts of the discussion while sorting scroll bundles, but continues his work because debates about the size of the earth do not make the catalog any easier to maintain. Mid-morning brings another small shipment from the harbor, this time containing scrolls copied in the city of Rhodes, and delivered by a trader who seems slightly nervous about handing them over to the royal officials responsible for collecting texts, because everyone knows the library has a reputation for occasionally keeping the most valuable originals, while returning copies to their owners. The scrolls are unwrapped carefully and passed to scribes who begin examining the handwriting, the ink quality, and the condition of the papyrus, because every detail matters when preserving documents that might become important sources for future generations. Our librarian records their arrival in the catalog and assigns temporary storage space, then carefully places small tags identifying their subjects, so scholars browsing the shelves will know exactly what lies within each tightly rolled cylinder of papyrus. By midday, the library is gently buzzing with activity, not loud or chaotic, but filled with quiet concentration as scribes copy text, line by line, while murmuring the words softly to themselves, a habit that helps maintain accuracy and also gives the room a strange musical quality as dozens of voices repeat fragments of poetry, philosophy, and science all at once. Somewhere nearby, a student is studying the medical teachings of Hippocrates, while another scholar is examining historical accounts connected to Herodotus, whose stories about distant lands fascinated readers even when they occasionally sounded a bit exaggerated. Our librarian walks quietly between the shelves checking for misplaced scrolls, because scholars sometimes become so absorbed in reading that they forget where a text belongs, leaving it resting in a corner where the next visitor might never think to search. Early afternoon brings a small moment of curiosity when a group of young students gathers around a visiting scholar who claims to have traveled far east and collected unusual astronomical observations that differ slightly from the familiar models studied in Alexandria, and while the details are complicated, the discussion remains calm as everyone politely examines the evidence and wonders whether the heavens might behave differently than previously believed. Our librarian listens briefly while adjusting a stack of scroll containers, but soon returns to his duties, because ideas about the stars may change over time, yet the physical scrolls holding those ideas still require careful storage. The slow hours of the afternoon pass peacefully as sunlight filters through the high windows, and dust particles drift lazily in the beams of light, giving the entire hall a quiet golden glow that makes the rows of papyrus bundles look almost like sleeping animals resting on wooden shelves. Eventually, the scribes finish copying the morning's texts and place the fresh scrolls beside the originals, allowing the librarian to inspect them briefly before they are officially entered into the permanent archive. This final step is important because once a scroll joins the collection, it becomes part of the immense body of knowledge that scholars across the Mediterranean hope to consult. And our librarian understands that every carefully labeled text strengthens the reputation of Alexandria as the intellectual center of the ancient world. As evening approaches, the scholars gradually end their debates, some satisfied with the day's discoveries, while others promise to continue arguing tomorrow about matters that might seem small, but carry enormous meaning within the world of scholarship. Our librarian performs his final walk through the aisles, making sure each scroll rests securely in its proper place. And outside, the fading sunlight paints the harbor with soft colors, while the great lighthouse of Alexandria prepares to ignite its guiding flame once more. Another day has passed in the quiet life of the library. Another day in which ideas have been copied, organized, debated, and preserved. And although nothing dramatic has occurred, the slow accumulation of knowledge continues steadily within these walls. Our librarian steps outside into the cool evening air, knowing that tomorrow will likely unfold in exactly the same peaceful pattern, and in a way that gentle repetition is the secret strength of the Library of Alexandria. Because while kings rule and armies march, the careful work of preserving knowledge happens quietly, one scroll at a time, guided by people whose names history rarely records, but whose patience keeps the wisdom of entire civilizations from disappearing into silence. The next day in Alexandria begins as usual, with sunlight slowly creeping over the harbor and fishermen already arguing about nets before the rest of the city has fully woken up. because some things about human nature never seem to change, no matter the century. Our librarian quietly prepares for another calm walk toward the Library of Alexandria, where thousands of scrolls wait patiently for someone to keep them organized. The streets are filling with the familiar rhythm of the city. Merchants setting up tables, carts rolling over stone roads, and students hurrying along with scrolls held dangerously close to their faces reading while walking as if the entire city were one giant classroom. The librarian arrives just as scribes settle into their workstations, dipping reed pens into ink and preparing fresh sheets of papyrus. The familiar scent of ink and fiber filling the hall with that oddly comforting aroma that longtime bookkeepers learn to associate with quiet thinking. The morning routine begins with checking the catalog, the enormous system first developed by scholars like Callimachus, whose detailed index organized texts by subject, author, and category so researchers could find what they needed without wandering through the building like lost visitors. Maintaining this system requires constant attention. Scrolls are borrowed, returned, copied, and occasionally misplaced by enthusiastic readers absorbed in their studies. Our librarian corrects small mistakes, adjusts tags, and places a newly copied scroll into the proper bundle beside similar works. Though these tasks seem minor, they are the invisible threads holding the intellectual world of Alexandria together. Not long after morning begins, two scholars arrive already debating a philosophical point connected to the teachings of Plato. Their discussion quickly grows complex, exploring abstract ideas about forms, knowledge, and the nature of reality, until someone accidentally knocks over a stack of scrolls and the conversation pauses so everything can be carefully rolled back into place. Moments like this remind the librarian that even great thinkers occasionally struggle with basic coordination. Across the hall, another group has gathered around a geometric diagram drawn on a scrap of papyrus, discussing proofs associated with Euclid. The conversation is calm but intense as scholars trace lines across the diagram, murmuring approval when a proof unfolds elegantly. Our librarian hears fragments while organizing scroll containers and briefly wonders whether mathematics always feels this satisfying to those who truly understand it. Meanwhile, scribes continue their steady work, copying texts from distant cities, filling the hall with a gentle murmur of voices, a soft chorus of literature, philosophy, and science. By mid-morning, a young student appears, overwhelmed by the sheer number of scrolls, clutching a note from his teacher requesting a commentary on Aristotle. The librarian calmly guides him through the shelves until the correct text is found, and the relief on the student's face shows how navigating the library can feel like exploring a maze designed by meticulous but slightly mischievous scholars. By midday, the library reaches a quiet peak, scholars reading intently while scribes finish copying the morning's texts. Nearby, a respectful debate unfolds about the historical accuracy of Thucydides, who meticulously chronicled wars and politics. Historians analyze sentences word by word, seeking to interpret events centuries later, while the librarian quietly passes by with repaired scrolls, maintaining order amidst the intellectual activity. As afternoon sunlight filters through high windows, dust drifts slowly in the warm beams, and the steady scratch of pens continues in the background. Knowledge grows gradually in the Library of Alexandria, one copied line at a time, one careful catalog entry after another. Our librarian moves steadily through the stacks, the patient caretaker of ideas that have traveled across oceans and generations. Eventually, the day slows as scholars return scrolls for reshelving, each bundle tied neatly and returned to its proper place. Outside, the harbor prepares for evening, the sun lowering toward the Mediterranean horizon, and the great lighthouse of Alexandria stands ready to ignite its guiding flame, signaling safety to ships from distant coasts. The librarian takes one final walk through the hall, ensuring every scroll rests exactly where it belongs. Though the day holds no dramatic events, another layer of knowledge has quietly been added to the library's ever-growing collection. Stepping into the cooling evening air, he reflects on the strange beauty of this routine life, a life among scrolls and Scholars where the greatest achievements often go unnoticed outside these walls. Tomorrow the cycle will begin again, another peaceful morning of cataloging, copying, and scholarly conversation. The Library of Alexandria continuing to grow slowly, patiently, and almost silently, guided by people whose greatest talent is keeping knowledge safe. The next morning in Alexandria begins slowly, almost lazily, the Mediterranean air still cool before the sun rises above the harbor. Our librarian wakes with the calm understanding that the day ahead will probably resemble the one before it, for the life of a librarian in the ancient world rarely involves sudden adventure, instead moving at the steady pace of ink drying on papyrus. Outside, the streets fill with the gentle chaos of the city as fishermen drag their catches to market. Merchants haggle politely over prices, and students hurry toward the scholarly district, carrying scrolls as if they were fragile treasures, which in many ways they are. He walks the familiar road toward the quiet halls of the Library of Alexandria, passing statues and marble courtyards glowing softly in the morning light, eventually entering the calm world of scrolls, scribes and scholars content to spend their lives among words written centuries earlier. Inside, scribes begin their work, dipping reed pens into ink and unrolling long sheets of papyrus across wooden desks, the gentle scratching filling the hall like steady rain against a window. Our librarian begins his inspection of the shelves, checking tags and scroll bundles with careful attention, aware that knowledge is fragile not only because papyrus tears easily, but also because ideas can vanish if no one preserves them. He notices a scholar quietly reading a historical text connected to Herodotus, whose detailed stories of distant lands still fascinate readers despite occasional imaginative flourishes. Nearby, another scholar studies mathematical diagrams inspired by Archimedes, whose brilliant ideas about geometry and mechanics ripple gently through the intellectual world. The librarian pauses briefly to ensure labels are correct before continuing to the philosophy section, where readers explore the works of Aristotle, whose writings attempt to explain nearly every aspect of life, from ethics and politics to biology and logic. Mid-morning brings another small shipment of scrolls from the harbor, copied in distant cities, and scribes examine handwriting, ink quality, and papyrus condition before preparing fresh copies for the archive. The librarian records each title in the catalog system, knowing that without these quiet entries, the library would quickly become an impossible maze. Hours pass as sunlight moves across high walls. Scholars drift between shelves reading and discussing ideas softly, and scribes continue copying line by line. Occasionally, debates arise, perhaps about a philosophical interpretation or the accuracy of a historical account, but they remain gentle, for scholars accustomed to reading understand that ideas unfold best when handled carefully. In the afternoon, the librarian repairs aging scrolls, reinforcing frayed edges with thin strips of papyrus, quietly humming to himself as patience transforms preservation into a nearly meditative act. Outside, Alexandria carries on. Ships arrive and depart, markets close, and the lighthouse of Alexandria readies its guiding flame above the harbor. Scribes finish their final copies, rolling fresh sheets into neat scrolls tied with thin cords and placing them on the librarian's desk. Each is inspected and returned to its proper shelf, another small contribution to the vast puzzle of human knowledge accumulated over generations. As evening falls, scholars leave carrying notes and ideas that may inspire tomorrow's debates, and the library grows quiet except for the faint rustle of papyrus settling on shelves. The librarian walks one final time through the hall, ensuring every scroll rests exactly where it belongs. Thousands of texts preserving centuries of thought from poets, mathematicians, historians, and philosophers who may never have imagined their words would one day reside together in a single building by the Mediterranean. Pausing in the center of the hall, he reflects that while kings and armies shape headlines, places like this quietly shape the memory of civilization. Extinguishing the lamps one by one, he steps outside into the evening air, the lighthouse now shining brightly across the dark water, guiding ships safely to Alexandria. Tomorrow, the library will open again, scribes will begin copying, scholars will return to their debates, and the librarian will continue his quiet routine. The work remains calm, patient, and largely unnoticed. Yet within this routine lies the reason the Library of Alexandria became one of the most legendary centers of learning in the ancient world. The day ends peacefully, scrolls resting silently on their shelves, while the city sleeps beyond the walls, waiting for another slow morning when knowledge will once again journey carefully from ink to memory, guided by the steady hands of a librarian, whose greatest achievement is simply ensuring that wisdom is never lost. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a quiet drift into a small tea house somewhere in Edo, the bustling heart of what we now call Tokyo, but back then just a collection of wooden streets, clattering rickshaws, and a smell of pickled things that could knock you off your feet if you weren't careful. Imagine the lanterns flickering against paper walls, the tatami mats soft under bare feet, and a distant murmur of merchants closing up shop for the evening. The tea house is modest, but its guests are mostly samurai, poets, and the occasional merchant who somehow paid enough to pretend he's cultured. We're not here for sword fights or scandalous duels, though, because tonight we're floating through the quiet tragedies, the odd habits, and the strangely human follies of the people who lived under the careful, polite chaos of the Tokugawa shogunate. The tea is brewed slowly, because why rush something that exists only to calm you? And as the steam rises, it's almost like watching tiny clouds perform a tiny, polite ballet above the cups. The proprietor, an older man with a face that's seen more rice seasons than you can count, wipes the counter with deliberate slowness, as if each swipe removes not only dust, but the small disappointments of the day. He has a daughter who insists on rearranging the bowls in the most aesthetically painful way for him, because teenagers in Edo have the same inexplicable desire to challenge authority as teenagers everywhere. The samurai at the corner table, clad in muted indigo, occasionally glances at the young woman with a polite mixture of annoyance and boredom, thinking about taxes he has to pay or a duel he probably shouldn't attend. The poet scribbles a few characters on rice paper, pauses, then dips the brush in tea because he's out of ink. Because why not? The tea house exists in a soft bubble where the outside world's rigid hierarchy still hums faintly, but inside, things slide gently, like silk over the fingers of someone who has spent their life handling the mundane and the absurd in equal measure. Let us float over to another quiet observation. The merchant who insists he is a patron of the arts, but actually comes mostly to see if the samurai are losing their tempers, because he enjoys a tiny socially safe thrill. His kimono is slightly too bright, which tells everyone that he either doesn't understand taste or doesn't care. And in this case, it's probably a little of both. The shogunate has imposed rules that cover everything from the number of folds in a sash to the permissible shade of blue in one's robe, but human beings have always been creative about finding loopholes. So the merchant's ostentatious color is a polite, soft rebellion, a whisper of personality in a world that prefers whispers over shouts. Across the room, a geisha practices her subtle smile, knowing that every movement is scrutinized by men who have too much time and too little imagination. She is polite, graceful, and perhaps a little tired of performing perfection in an imperfect world, and she sips her tea with an elegance that belies the fact that she is counting down the minutes until she can escape to a small dark corner and breathe like a normal person. Of course, no Edo tea house would be complete without the subtle tragedy of the young samurai who trains endlessly, polishes his sword until it's reflective, enough to blind himself if he looks too long, and still worries that he won't live up to some imagined ancestral expectation. His father, naturally, is somewhere else worrying that his son won't be as competent as him, which is almost guaranteed, because genetics and luck tend to conspire against you in quiet, inconvenient ways. The young man's hair is tied in a perfect topknot, his posture stiff as a bamboo pole, and yet when he thinks no one is watching, he fidgets with the hem of his kimono, a tiny rebellion of nervousness against the carefully curated stoicism required by society. He imagines duels he will never fight, loves he will never admit, and failures that might not even exist. and the room absorbs all of this quietly, like tatami soaking up spilled tea. Meanwhile, a distant rickshaw clatters over wooden planks outside, bringing a reminder that life continues, slightly inconvenient, slightly out of tune. And the tea house becomes a small island where time slows, conversation is measured, and the world feels a little softer. The owner hums a tune that might be 200 years old, or maybe he just made it up, but it works just as well. A small ritual that keeps everything polite and predictable. His wife, who is arranging dried flowers in a vase that nobody will comment on, knows the importance of such rituals, because chaos lurks just beyond the paper walls, and the illusion of control is comforting, even if it's mostly imaginary. The tea steams in cups, conversation flows gently, and everyone participates in the unspoken understanding that the world is easier to digest when it moves slowly, politely, and just a little bit absurdly. Let's drift toward one more figure before we close this first stretch. A scholar hunched over scrolls that smell faintly of ink and dust, scribbling notes about poetry and economics, and maybe the occasional observation that nobody will ever read. He wears glasses that slide down his nose constantly, and he doesn't seem to notice or care. He hums softly, occasionally punctuating his thoughts with a tiny, resigned sigh, because centuries of etiquette and scholarship have left him in a mild state of permanent exhaustion. His students, seated across from him in disciplined rows, mirror this subtle melancholy, copying characters slowly, as if by doing so they might absorb some hidden wisdom that the masters of the past insist is there. The tea house, already a haven for calm and mild curiosity, becomes a stage for this quiet daily performance of patience, human frailty, and the strange poetry of small, often ignored moments that define a life lived quietly in Edo. By the time the lanterns burn low and the first cool breezes creep through the slightly open shoshi screens, the tea house holds its residents in a gentle, contemplative bubble. The merchant has counted his polite thrills, the samurai has rehearsed his unspoken anxieties, the geisha has performed and survived, and the scholar has transmitted tiny fragments of ancient knowledge, perhaps useless, but soothing nonetheless. Outside, life continues with its slightly chaotic insistence, but inside, the world feels manageable, like a slow exhale after centuries of forced decorum. The tea house itself seems to sigh, settling into a quiet rhythm as each visitor prepares to leave, carrying a fraction of peace with them, if only until the rickshaw hits a pothole and reality intrudes again. And so, we end our first evening of gentle observation with the understanding that history, much like this tea, is best sipped slowly, appreciated for its subtle flavors, and occasionally seasoned with tiny bits of human absurdity that make it memorable in ways that textbooks rarely capture. The Edo Tea House stands as a quiet testament to polite chaos, measured living, and the peculiar, endlessly fascinating habits of people who knew how to survive in a world that demanded perfection, but only rewarded patience. The soft clatter of departing footsteps, the faint smell of brewed tea lingering in the air, and the unspoken acknowledgement that tomorrow will bring another evening, just as quiet, just as mildly complicated, provide the perfect lullaby for anyone interested in drifting through history without urgency, drama, or unnecessary excitement. As the night stretches on and the tea house empties slowly, leaving behind only the scent of wet tatami and half-finished cups, we turn our attention to the quieter streets outside, where lanterns swing lazily on wooden posts, casting elongated shadows that seem almost too dramatic for the actual movement of people. The rickshaws have thinned, replaced by the occasional solitary traveler, mostly samurai returning from meetings that were probably important in some bureaucratic sense, but mostly involved talking politely about taxes and the proper folding of documents. Their footsteps echo faintly on the wooden planks, reminding anyone listening that Edo sleeps lightly, never fully, because the city itself hums like a subdued orchestra tuned to a minor key. Let's float to a tiny, narrow alley where a boy sweeps the steps of a noodle stall he does not own, but has been paid in noodles and polite smiles to maintain. His kimono is patched, his sandals slightly loose, And yet he takes pride in the ritual of sweeping, because in Edo, even the smallest gesture is a statement of order, and the boy enjoys asserting control over what little chaos he can manage. A cat weaves between his legs, indifferent to the meticulously arranged broom strokes, because cats have never cared about human standards of etiquette, a fact that likely frustrated Edo's elite more than they would ever admit. The steam rising from a distant bowl of noodles forms tiny clouds that drift lazily, mimicking the boy's calm, deliberate movements, as if the universe itself conspired to teach patience in very small increments. Nearby, a middle-aged poet sits on a wooden step, scrolls tucked under one arm, hair slightly disheveled in a manner that screams, "I am a genius," but also too lazy to care. He sips lukewarm tea from a chipped cup, eyes half closed, observing the alley with a combination of mild judgment and existential fatigue. His thoughts wander to the haikus he will never finish, the patrons who will never appreciate subtlety, and the inevitable fact that history may remember him as slightly eccentric at best. His companion, a small dog of dubious breed and even more dubious temperament, yawns widely, exposing teeth that are slightly too sharp for comfort. A quiet reminder that even loyal friends are mildly threatening if you look at them too closely. The poet hums softly, as if the melody itself can patch the minor annoyances of life into something tolerable, or at least slightly less tiresome. Across the city, a young nobleman practices calligraphy in a dimly lit room of his modestly impressive estate. He has a strict regimen, one taught by his father, who once was slightly stricter and probably scarier, but now only hovers like a shadow of obligation. The ink flows slowly a little too thick because he accidentally added water from the wrong container, and he sighs not, loudly but in a way that lets the universe know he is slightly disappointed in its handling of liquids. Each stroke is deliberate, careful, and perfectly imperfect, a tiny rebellion against both gravity and parental expectation. Outside his window, cherry blossoms drift in the breeze, petals falling in an almost mocking dance, because nature in Edo has a peculiar sense of humor that aligns strangely well with human frustration. And then there's the minor scandal that nobody mentions, but everyone suspects, the lady of the house, who secretly feeds the nobleman extra sweets while pretending it is medicinal. She walks with grace, arms folded neatly, eyes cast in glances that suggest she knows the full extent of human absurdity, but has wisely chosen to ignore it, at least for now. Her servants, trained in the art of politeness bordering on paranoia, mirror her movements like shadows, carrying trays of tea and flowers with a precision that might have been impressive if anyone had time to notice. The nobleman, oblivious to this quiet conspiracy, continues his calligraphy, slightly sticky from sugar, unaware that minor indulgences often teach lessons in patience more effectively than strict discipline ever could. Meanwhile, the streets beyond this quiet estate hum with subtle life. A group of children races past, their wooden sandals clattering, voices a high, fleeting chorus that vanishes as quickly as it arrives. The elders watching from their doorways shake heads with mild irritation, thinking about the transience of youth and the curious insistence of children to make noise in a world that favors calm. One particularly bold child pauses, balancing on a single beam, almost tipping over, before catching herself with a flourish that deserves an unspoken round of applause. The watchers offer none, because in Edo, etiquette insists that public admiration must be measured and restrained, a philosophy that ensures that every act of daring is observed only in the mind's eye, never acknowledged out loud. Back in the tea house, the lanterns have dimmed further, barely glowing, casting a gentle amber across the surfaces. The proprietor sits quietly, counting coins with a diligence that makes every penny feel like an accomplishment, though none will ever know the effort. A breeze slips through the slightly open door, rustling papers and nudging cups, reminding him that despite years of effort, control is always an illusion. The daughter, now resting against a wall, watches him with amusement, knowing that someday she will inherit this delicate balancing act of patience, politeness, and minor chaos. Outside, Edo itself seems to hold its breath, waiting for tomorrow's rituals, tomorrow's absurdities, and tomorrow's quiet tragedies that will unfold slowly, without fanfare, but with perfect consistency. And somewhere, in a corner barely noticed, a ronin who has no patrons and no real purpose scribbles notes about the world. Each character a small act of defiance against a life that has not been kind. He hums a tune faintly similar to the proprietor's, a private homage to order, to calm, to the very notion that even in chaos, one can carve a moment of stillness. The night stretches, wide and patient, embracing the city with all its quirks, small disasters, and human frailties. The moon rises lazily above rooftops, illuminating the occasional flicker of emotion, the quiet sorrow of unspoken ambitions, and the subtle humor embedded in daily life that Edo never bothered to explain, but everyone felt. And so we conclude this segment of the evening, letting the slow hum of tea, ink, and polite absurdity carry us forward. History in Edo is never loud, rarely dramatic, but endlessly human. Each figure, samurai, poet, merchant, scholar, plays a small part in the gentle, rhythmic unfolding of life. Each mistake, indulgence, and minor triumph adds a soft layer to the tapestry of time, weaving a narrative that lulls rather than startles, encourages observation rather than outrage, and rewards patience rather than impatience. The tea houses, alleys, and estates all rest under the same soft sky, promising that tomorrow more subtle absurdities will appear more quiet. Disappointments will occur, and yet in the end life will remain calmly, gently, and mildly entertainingly human. As the night lingers and the city's usual clatter softens into distant echoes, we turn our attention to a minor daimyo, one of those lords who ruled over a handful of rice paddies and a single, modest castle that he probably paid too much to maintain. Because that is how Edo hierarchy worked. Appearances mattered more than outcomes, and rituals mattered more than reason. His robes are slightly too elaborate for the actual size of his holdings, which is a fact he appreciates quietly, knowing that overcompensation is a subtle but reliable way to command respect, or at least polite fear. He sits alone in a dimly lit study, fanning himself with a lacquered fan that might be older than he is, pondering matters of state that are likely far beyond the capacity of either himself or the world to care about. He drinks tea that has been cooled to just the right temperature, though in reality, right is mostly an excuse to prolong the act of drinking. Outside, the wind rattles a shutter, producing a noise that could be ominous, but in Edo, noise is mostly a gentle reminder that life is ongoing, indifferent, and mildly inconvenient. The daimyo hums a tune of his own invention, a lullaby for adults who have forgotten how to sleep properly, and his cat, a fat calico with a superiority complex, curls on a silk cushion, apparently judging everything in sight. It's a quiet scene, full of personal rituals, minor anxieties, and a subtle awareness that the universe rarely aligns with human expectation. Let's drift to the scholar across town, hunched over a desk cluttered with scrolls, some of them ancient, others merely unreadable because of poor handwriting. He corrects minor mistakes in classical poetry with a tiny brush, sighing after each stroke, because perfection is impossible, and he has decided it is his duty to try anyway. Occasionally he glances at a candle, wondering if it is too dim or too bright, though he knows perfectly well that the exact answer is irrelevant. His students, sitting cross-legged in precise rows, mimic his gestures, producing faint, almost imperceptible rustling sounds as they attempt to copy characters exactly. This minor sound is the soundtrack of dedication, boredom, and subtle rebellion against discipline, all mixed together in an agreeable monotone. Meanwhile, the poet we met earlier wanders through the narrow streets, scrolls tucked under his arm, contemplating an idea for a poem about a cat he saw once, which may or may not have existed. He pauses to adjust his topknot, sighing at the inconvenience of hair and societal expectations simultaneously. Children playing nearby notice him, but rather than engaging, they scatter with polite caution, because in Edo, strangers are always slightly suspicious, especially those with ink-stained fingers and unshakable self-importance. He continues on, humming softly, writing mental notes on minor absurdities, cataloging them with the precision of a man who knows that the world is too fleeting for major concerns, but too predictable to ignore small ones. Back in a modest tea house near the river, a merchant arranges his wares for the morning market. Though he works late into the night, because insomnia is a subtle companion in Edo for those with small anxieties and large ambitions. He fusses over wooden boxes, polishing surfaces obsessively, while thinking about prices, taxes, and the slightly embarrassing fact that he is deeply in love with a geisha who will never notice him. His thoughts drift between business strategy and personal inadequacy with remarkable speed, settling occasionally on existential considerations like, is anyone watching me? Or does it not matter? The answer is mostly, not particularly. But the question is comforting nonetheless, because it gives the illusion of control in a city that delights in reminding people how small they really are. Let us float to another quietly tragic figure, the young noble woman who has been raised in a strict household with little affection and far too many expectations. She sits near an open window, polishing a delicate porcelain vase with meticulous care, her hands moving slowly as if speed might disrupt the fragile balance of the world. Her thoughts drift to the absurdity of marriage arrangements that will likely decide her fate long before she feels she has one. She practices the slightest, most perfect smiles in a mirror, fully aware that her family will evaluate them like they were currency. Yet in these small, private moments, she allows herself tiny rebellions, like humming under her breath or imagining her hair loose and free, as if one quiet fantasy could ever matter in Edo's polite, suffocating hierarchy. Meanwhile, the quiet streets hum with minor life. A blind musician plays a shakuhachi under a dim lantern, producing notes that float lazily into the night, creating a soundtrack for contemplation, mild melancholy, and faint amusement at the world's insistence on order. He performs for no one, yet everyone listens, even if only with half attention, because in Edo, music is less about audience and more about patience. The notes echo off wooden walls and paper screens, mixing with the scent of tea, the soft scrape of brooms, and the occasional distant call of a child, producing a lullaby of urban life that is uniquely Edo, controlled quiet and somehow both comforting and a little unsettling. Back in a larger estate, a minor daimyo's secretary pores over paperwork, meticulously rewriting mistakes he did not make, because responsibility and blame are carefully calibrated in Edo's social structure. He sighs quietly, noting small injustices like ink blots, poorly folded papers, and the persistent, low-level incompetence of human nature. Outside, the moon illuminates garden paths with a muted glow, showing blossoms, stones, and perfectly raked gravel in a way that is beautiful but entirely performative. The secretary occasionally glances up at the moon, wondering if it too judges silently, or if, like everything else, it simply exists without concern. And then there's the minor tragedy of the tea house cat, who has learned that humans are unreliable and tea is only occasionally accompanied by treats. It wanders lazily among the low tables, observing the fleeting lives of samurai, poets, and merchants, silently mocking each human for the absurdity of their concerns. The cat, naturally indifferent, demonstrates a level of calm sophistication that most Edo residents secretly aspire to, if only in private, fleeting moments. The tea, now cooled and mostly forgotten, smells faintly bitter, a reminder that patience is sometimes rewarded with subtle disappointments, a lesson that most people in Edo take to heart with quiet acceptance. And so the night continues, soft and unbroken, moving like gentle water over stones, carrying the city's small triumphs, minor failures, and endless repetitions. Samurai, poets, merchants, scholars, and cats all participate in the rhythm, each acting out their roles in the quiet theater of Edo. Mistakes are observed only in passing, disappointments dissolve quietly, and absurdities go largely unnoticed unless they are convenient for reflection. The streets, estates, and tea houses remain patient witnesses to this calm absurdity, where human life unfolds slowly, predictably, and gently enough to encourage observation without excitement. By the time the first pale light of morning touches the rooftops, the city has almost forgotten the night. Though its residents carry its tiny lessons, the minor rebellions, the small indulgences, the slightly ridiculous habits, and the quiet reminders that life is tolerable if not entirely fair, when approached with patience, subtle humor, and a complete tolerance for absurdity. Edo wakes slowly, as it has for centuries, ready to repeat the same calm, polite, slightly tragic patterns with remarkable consistency. History in this sense is less about dramatic events and more about the gentle continuous unfolding of human life, observed in the soft glow of lanterns, the subtle hum of streets, and the quiet reflections of those who participate in it without urgency or complaint. As the sun rises just a fraction, barely touching the wooden rooftops of Edo, we drift toward another quiet corner of the city, where the household of a slightly eccentric poet and minor bureaucrat exists in its own bubble of careful absurdity. He keeps dozens of scrolls stacked by subject, color, and importance, though nobody else in the household could possibly tell the difference, which is exactly the point. His morning begins with tea served at precisely the wrong temperature, because he has spent years perfecting the illusion of ritual and still fails in small, amusing ways. He hums a tune only slightly off-key, enjoying the dissonance as a private joke with the universe, and the cat, fat and immobile, flicks its tail in quiet judgment, as if to remind him that perfection is overrated. Meanwhile, in a slightly larger estate, a minor daimyo examines his reflection in a polished bronze basin, adjusting his robes, topknot, and expression to convey calm authority, despite a persistent sense of mild panic about the rice yield this year. He has spent decades mastering the art of controlled worry, which mostly involves staring at the ceiling, sipping tea, and muttering polite curses that nobody can hear. Outside his window, servants shuffle quietly along stone paths, carrying baskets of firewood, flower arrangements, and scrolls nobody will ever read, all choreographed to suggest efficiency and calm. The daimyo appreciates this illusion, knowing that appearances matter far more than reality in Edo's delicate social ecosystem. Back at the poet's humble residence, the maid carries a tray with breakfast, moving carefully so as not to disturb the stacks of scrolls, or the faintly nervous scholar attempting to meditate in the corner. She hums softly, because even minor tunes are required in Edo to maintain decorum, and the hum is neither too cheerful nor too mournful, striking exactly the right balance of polite indifference. The poet pretends to sip from his cup with exaggerated elegance, fully aware that the temperature is wrong, the tea bitter, and the maid watching him with thinly concealed amusement. These small details, however, form the delicate scaffolding of life in Edo, minor absurdities appreciated in quiet, gentle increments that reward patience more than logic. Let's float toward a slightly tragic, yet entirely polite, domestic scene. A young noblewoman practicing dance in a courtyard surrounded by bamboo fencing. Her movements are precise, elegant, and subtly rebellious, because she has memorized every rule and decided to bend just enough to remind herself that control is optional. Her tutor watches with a stoic expression, which is mostly intended to make the student sweat quietly, though he secretly fears she may surpass him in skill, a fact that terrifies him slightly. Petals drift through the air from a nearby cherry tree, landing on her kimono in arrangements that look intentional, though they are entirely accidental, reinforcing the subtle absurdity that life often arranges for those who observe too closely. Meanwhile, in a tiny alley lined with paper lanterns, a merchant inspects his shop before the morning crowd arrives, fretting over small details like the alignment of jars, the exact shade of pickled vegetables, and the faintly crooked signage that nobody will likely notice. He carries a small notebook filled with scribbles that could be poetry or business records, the distinction irrelevant to him at this hour. The cat in his shop wanders lazily across shelves, occasionally swatting at a dangling decoration, providing just enough unpredictability to make the merchant feel that life is, at least slightly, alive. He mutters polite curses under his breath, not for anyone to hear, because etiquette dictates that complaints should be private, subtle, and infused with mild exaggeration for personal amusement. Back at the scholar's house, the young apprentices copy delicate characters on rice paper, striving for perfection in a world that values patience more than speed. They dip brushes into ink, slowly, deliberately, making tiny mistakes that are expected and quietly corrected with a gentle sigh. The scholar observes, occasionally adjusting a wrist, muttering historical facts that drift past comprehension, because the goal is not understanding but ritual, repetition, and the faint sense that discipline creates quiet satisfaction. Occasionally, a faint breeze disturbs papers or scrolls, creating a ripple of minor chaos, which is absorbed with quiet acceptance, because in Edo, the universe rarely rewards effort, but it always rewards observation. Meanwhile, a minor samurai practices sword forms in a secluded courtyard, moving with precision, grace, and a faintly exaggerated concern for aesthetics. His movements are almost ceremonial, designed to show skill without actually needing to face conflict, which is fortunate, because Edo favors calm over combat. He pauses, adjusting his top knot and silently judging his own reflection in a puddle, which has accumulated despite his best efforts to maintain a polished courtyard. Water reflects the sky, trees, and the faint absurdity of a man striving for perfection in a world that barely notices. He sighs softly, continues his forms, and allows the faintest hint of pride to creep into his otherwise stoic expression, because minor victories are essential, even when unnoticed. Across town, a minor geisha prepares for the day's appointments, carefully arranging hairpins, folding kimono layers, and practicing subtle expressions that convey interest, detachment, or polite amusement as needed. She moves with a calm precision learned from years of training, yet privately, she dreams of a life where she might speak freely, laugh loudly, or perhaps refuse tea for an entire day without apology. Her patrons are largely unaware of these small rebellions, focused instead on their own minor dramas, which provides her with quiet satisfaction, the illusion of control over others without risking any meaningful confrontation. Even in Edo, such small triumphs are treasured and rare. Back in a quiet alley, a street musician begins to play a soft tune on a shamisen, strings vibrating slowly in the early light. The notes float through the city, carrying minor stories of hope, minor sadness, and absurdly gentle humor for those who listen. Children pause briefly, intrigued, though they do not stay long, because curiosity in Edo is always tempered by etiquette. The merchant adjusts a jar, the poet hums softly, and the noblewoman's movements pause just enough to align with the invisible rhythm, creating a collective, though largely accidental, orchestration of calm life. Each note, each motion, each sigh contributes to the subtle continuity of the city, which hums patiently like a soft, polite machine running smoothly despite human quirks. By mid-morning, the tea houses, alleys, and estates have settled into a rhythm of minor absurdities and gentle repetition. Samurai, poets, merchants, scholars, geisha, and noblewomen all play their parts, acting out private rituals and tiny rebellions within the constraints of an ordered society. Mistakes are expected, indulgences accepted quietly, and human imperfection celebrated in small, almost imperceptible ways. The city itself absorbs it all, holding the stories of its residents like ink soaking into delicate paper, ready to release them again at night when lanterns flicker and the world slows to a polite, reflective rhythm. And so we leave this section of Edo life with the understanding that history is not always about grand events, loud proclamations, or dramatic conflicts. Often, it is about small moments, quietly observed, gently exaggerated, and mildly absurd, producing a tapestry of human behavior that is endlessly fascinating when seen through a lens of patience, subtle humor, and quiet reflection. Edo moves softly, deliberately, and predictably, and in its motions, we glimpse the universal truth that life, when slowed down, reveals the tiny absurdities, minor triumphs, and subtle tragedies that define existence more than any battle ever could. As afternoon drifts lazily into evening, the light softens over Edo, painting rooftops and wooden streets in muted gold. And we return, one last time, to the minor dramas that quietly shape this city. In a small estate, a young nobleman adjusts his papers with a careful deliberation bordering on obsessive, because he has spent decades convincing himself that order in paperwork equals order in life. He sips tea that has cooled beyond reasonable warmth, and watches a servant meticulously sweep fallen petals from the veranda. It's a minor, silent contest of patience and decorum, where each participant performs perfectly meaningless rituals that, paradoxically, make life slightly more bearable. Outside, the wind ruffles bamboo leaves, scattering shadows across tatami, as if the universe itself enjoys the quiet absurdity of human effort. Meanwhile, the poet revisits his tiny studio, a space cluttered with half-finished scrolls and ink stains that form unintentional constellations across the paper. He hums softly, noting the peculiar irony that his own handwriting sometimes seems foreign, as if he is watching another person struggle to convey sense. He dips his brush in tea rather than ink, not out of ignorance but mild rebellion, because life in Edo is full of small, harmless acts of defiance that soothe the soul more than they disturb the world. The maid quietly observes him, amused by his absent-minded rituals, and the cat curls near the window, utterly indifferent to human absurdities, a silent reminder that calm, like excellence, is mostly a matter of detachment. Across the city, a minor geisha practices the same delicate motions she has rehearsed for years, adjusting hairpins and folding kimono layers with impeccable precision. Yet today, she allows herself a tiny error, a slightly crooked pin, a faintly uneven fold, as if to remind herself that perfection is overrated, and that minor imperfections are the only real proof of life. She sips tea, observing the faint light from lanterns already lit along streets and alleys, knowing that the night will eventually erase most of her efforts. And she smiles softly, privately, because small, unnoticed triumphs are often sweeter than grand recognition in a world built on polite observation. Let's float to a more humorous, mildly tragic figure. A minor daimyo, frowning over a ledger that seems to contain endless mistakes, most of them imaginary. He sighs quietly, polishing his ceremonial fan, glancing out a window at carefully raked gardens that are already slightly disturbed by wind and birds. His cat yawns on a stone lantern, silently mocking his concern, and he allows himself a small chuckle, which is rare, polite, and almost imperceptible. Life has taught him that the illusion of control is more comforting than control itself, and he takes solace in this tiny, quiet realization, aware that tomorrow will bring similar frustrations, just as politely orchestrated. Meanwhile, in a narrow alley, a street musician plays the shamisen again, fingers moving with deliberate slowness, producing notes that drift lazily, almost like a gentle conversation with the wind. Passers-by pause only briefly, glancing, smiling faintly, and moving on, as if acknowledging life's absurdities without comment. The merchant nearby inspects jars of pickles, adjusting lids, and muttering quietly about proportions, completely aware that the universe does not care about symmetry or seasoning. Children, briefly attentive, scatter politely, leaving the city streets to absorb this quiet choreography of effort, observation, and minor rebellion, where every tiny action has purpose only in the mind of the actor. And then there's the minor tragedy of the scholar, still hunched over his scrolls, correcting characters, sighing at the imperfection of ink, paper, and human ambition alike. He mutters softly, sometimes in historical references, sometimes in exasperation at his own limitations, fully aware that no one will read these notes, and yet continues, because the act itself provides a gentle, predictable comfort. His apprentices copy diligently, occasionally glancing at the faintly ridiculous seriousness of their master, learning, unknowingly, that the smallest absurdities often define the texture of life more than grand events ever could. Back at the tea house, the proprietor cleans slowly, deliberately, aware that tonight, like every night, he maintains a delicate balance between order and chaos, customer satisfaction and polite indifference. The daughter leans against a wall, watching, quietly amused by the tiny rebellions of the staff, the patrons, and the minor misfortunes of life that drift like steam from half-empty teacups. Lanterns flicker, shadows stretch, and the faint scent of tea and incense lingers, creating a calm cocoon where human imperfection is observed without judgment, and minor tragedies are absorbed with gentle amusement. The patrons, few now, sip quietly, hum softly, and prepare to depart, carrying fragments of the tea house's calm absurdity into the wider city, where life will continue, mildly chaotic, politely constrained, and endlessly human. Finally, as dusk deepens into night, Edo settles into its familiar rhythm. The wind rustles bamboo, distant lanterns glow faintly, and the faint hum of life continues in alleys, estates, and tea houses. Samurai polish swords they will never need. Poets correct words that may never be read. Merchants fret over details that mostly do not matter. And noblewomen perform quiet rebellions hidden beneath layers of etiquette. The city, patient and enduring, absorbs these minor dramas, preserving them in the rhythm of daily life that is less about events and more about observation, patience, and the delicate humor of human existence. And so we leave Edo behind for now with its paper screens, subtle absurdities, polite frustrations, and gentle, patient rituals. History seen in these quiet moments is less about wars, proclamations, or grand achievements, and more about the small, overlooked patterns of life, the minor misfortunes, the little indulgences, the quiet rebellions, and the faint, absurd humor that threads through ordinary existence. The tea houses, alleys, estates, and streets will remain, quietly observing, and perhaps reminding us that the essence of human life is best understood not in noise or spectacle, but in patience, observation, and the gentle rhythmic unfolding of daily absurdities. So as the lanterns dim, the cats curl, and the last traces of tea vapor drift lazily into the night, we drift too, softly, gently, and without urgency, carried by the slow, calm, and endlessly fascinating heartbeat of Edo. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a slow wander across one of the most famous, over-engineered, and slightly absurd feats of human stubbornness in history, the Great Wall of China. Now, before you picture neat bricks stacked like Lego towers, think instead of endless mountains, scorching sun, freezing wind, and rivers that really did not care about imperial planning. The wall stretches over 13,000 miles, which is roughly the equivalent of someone deciding that walking back and forth across China a few times is a fun weekend project. And of course, this wasn't built by machines, or even mildly helpful cranes, but by people, mostly conscripted laborers, soldiers, and unfortunate villagers who somehow thought, why not double down on forced labor today? Let's float over to the mountains first, because geography was merciless. Builders had to haul stones up slopes so steep that anyone with a shred of common sense would have quit immediately. There are stories of carts getting stuck, of workers sliding back down the slope, and of supervisors shouting from above, probably while sipping tea in slightly more comfortable positions. Imagine being told your job is to move half-ton rocks uphill with nothing but ropes and sheer stubbornness, and that the emperor wants it done yesterday. Some of them did quit, some fell, and some probably muttered existential complaints no historian will ever record. The wall, as a result, has sections that are both awe-inspiring and slightly wonky, like a massive DIY project that went on for centuries without proper instructions. And speaking of centuries, this construction was not a weekend affair. It spanned multiple dynasties, each adding their own flair, oversight, and bureaucratic nonsense. The Qin dynasty started the first connected sections under Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who famously had a thing for immortality and apparently thought a giant wall would also protect him from death, because why not extend that logic? Soldiers, peasants, and sometimes convicts were dragged from villages across the empire, organized into poorly fed labor battalions, and sent to slog up mountains or across deserts with little to no medical care. A few tried to escape, a few succeeded, and the rest built a wall so long that even the emperor probably stopped checking on the farthest ends after a while. Of course, supply logistics were a nightmare. The wall isn't just stones. It's bricks, mortar, and every conceivable small building material you can imagine. And everything had to be transported without carts on mountain passes that were narrower than a modern hallway. Food, water, tools, and even simple things like clothing had to reach workers, or else morale would collapse faster than you could say, Great Wall. It is said that villages along the route were often stripped bare to feed the laborers, leaving locals slightly grumpy, hungry, and increasingly creative with ways to complain without invoking imperial wrath. Even in the dry deserts, water was scarce, which led to mild but persistent dehydration, fainting, and possibly very bad jokes about why someone thought a wall was a good idea in a desert in the first place. Let's drift toward the human element, because this is where history really gets mildly tragic and fascinating. Laborers were organized into units, sometimes of hundreds, sometimes thousands, each under supervisors who wielded sticks, not diplomacy. The laborers often slept in temporary camps, exposed to wind, rain, and the occasional wandering tiger. They cooked over tiny fires, shared meager rations, and whispered stories about loved ones, far away mostly, in the form of grumbling curses directed at officials. It is hard to imagine a modern office complaining about email when these people were literally hauling bricks uphill in freezing temperatures for months on end. The Great Wall, while impressive, is also a monument to human endurance, stubbornness, and a very questionable approach to labor management. And then there's the sheer coordination of effort across distances that would make today's project managers break into tears. Workers at one end might be using one type of brick, while another section half 1,000 miles away is cobbled together with stone, rubble, and mud, because supply chains in ancient China were apparently slightly chaotic. Engineers had to account for local terrain, resource availability, and the likelihood of workers not showing up because they had run away or been eaten by disease. Yes, disease. Dysentery, scurvy, and minor infections were frequent companions, yet construction continued as if persistence alone could defy human mortality. Supervisors documented progress, wrote reports, and occasionally executed someone to enforce discipline, which may or may not have actually increased productivity, but probably made people very cautious about accidentally dropping a stone. Meanwhile, bricks themselves were not always manufactured locally. In some regions, workers had to make their own bricks from clay, shape them, fire them in kilns, and then haul them uphill or across plains. This sounds exhausting because it was, and it explains why some stretches of the wall are wider, taller, or more crooked than others. Perfection was aspirational. Uniformity was mostly optional. Some historians argue that these quirks give the wall its character, while others, perhaps less charitably, describe it as a slightly insane patchwork project that nobody checked on fully. Laborers, in their infinite wisdom, occasionally inserted small messages, marks, or symbols into bricks' ancient graffiti, because humans have always felt the urge to leave a tiny trace, even while dying slowly from overwork. Let's float to the minor tragedies of desert construction. In arid regions, water and shade were luxuries, and workers often relied on small streams or what little they could carry. Some accounts describe whole crews collapsing under heat, while others developed ingenious ways to ration water, including sharing small amounts that would barely keep a person conscious. Food was often rice or millet cooked in ways that were barely edible, giving rise to a quiet but persistent complaint that probably echoed across the empire. Except in recorded history, the echoes were replaced by official reports claiming that morale was acceptable. Supervisors naturally drank tea, occasionally wrote stern memos, and wondered why anyone wasn't more enthusiastic about hauling stone across a desert. And then there's the matter of coordination between dynasties, which was slightly like passing a half-finished Lego set to someone else and hoping they'd done to destroy the structure. The Qin sections were continued under the Han. The Ming rebuilt older stretches, and each dynasty added fortifications, watchtowers, and minor embellishments that were often more aesthetic than functional. Workers had to adapt to new instructions, unfamiliar building techniques, and ever-changing bureaucratic oversight. Mistakes were inevitable, as were minor accidents, and yet, somehow after centuries of inconsistent supply chains, indifferent labor, and geographic absurdity, the wall persisted, sprawling across mountains, deserts, and plains, like a long, slightly grumpy reminder that humans are both remarkably persistent and occasionally completely unreasonable. Meanwhile, in villages along the wall, the local population endured mild misery as their crops were requisitioned, their sons conscripted, and their livestock eaten or driven away. Occasionally, someone would rebel in a very quiet way, hiding tools, moving stones incorrectly, or telling long, sarcastic stories about imperial overreach, but these small acts rarely made it into official histories. Officials continued to march along, inspecting work, nodding politely, and possibly thinking that if a few thousand laborers collapsed today, well, tomorrow they would simply replace them, because why not? The logistics of feeding, housing, and motivating human labor across thousands of miles of terrain were not exactly mastered, and yet, through a combination of sheer stubbornness, fear, and minimal ingenuity, the wall continued to grow. And then we have minor absurdities like transporting timber for watchtowers in mountainous regions. Workers had to cut trees, carve them into beams, and somehow drag them uphill using ropes, human strength, and perhaps mild curses directed at the universe. Accidents were frequent, some minor, some fatal, and occasionally a tree would roll downhill, taking a few unlucky laborers along, which, unsurprisingly, slowed construction. Supervisors probably shrugged, checked the logs, and made someone write a report noting progress satisfactory, because bureaucratic consistency is easier to maintain than human sympathy. And yet, despite these absurd obstacles, the wall remained a slow but steady monument to human effort, patience, and slightly obsessive imperial willpower. Now as we continue, let's float toward the sections of the wall that crossed rivers, which naturally were a minor logistical nightmare because ancient China had no plans to make life easy. Workers had to drag stones, bricks, and timber through mud, build temporary platforms, and somehow align everything so that the wall wouldn't collapse at the first flood. Spoiler, it sometimes did. Supervisors, of course, wrote polite reports describing the floods as minor inconveniences, which is history speak for everything is falling apart. But let's not panic. Laborers waded through water, sometimes knee-deep, sometimes chest-deep, muttering sarcastic prayers that went unrecorded, while engineers measured distances with rudimentary tools and apparently a lot of guesswork. In desert stretches, the challenge was entirely different, but equally miserable. Sand, wind, and blistering sun made brick hauling resemble a very slow form of modern torture. Water was scarce, shade non-existent, and mosquitoes, surprisingly industrious even in arid regions, made their rounds. Food was rationed strictly, usually dried grains that probably tasted like cardboard to anyone with functioning taste buds. Workers carried bricks over dunes, often losing balance, stepping into holes, or collapsing mid-stride, which led to supervisors developing a slight fondness for issuing punishments that were more about symbolism than effectiveness. Yet somehow, mile after mile, the wall inched forward, a testament to human endurance and the mild absurdity of imperial ambition. Meanwhile, winter added its own subtle cruelty. In northern regions, temperatures could drop far below comfortable, and snow made paths slick and treacherous. Laborers dressed in layers of rough fabric, shivering as they moved stones that were already heavy at room temperature. Frostbite, minor injuries, and frozen tools were common, yet construction continued with the same quiet stubbornness that characterized all major wall projects. Supervisors occasionally bundled themselves in warm robes, sipping tea and writing reports on progress despite challenging conditions, which is a polite way of saying, some people are suffering and we're barely noticing. It's almost soothing to imagine them typing or scribbling while outside. Men and women hauled stones and ice alike, living examples of the absurd commitment required to complete this project. And then there's the human drama, because it would be historically incomplete without it. Conscripts included criminals, convicts, and peasants pressed into service. Some were recruited voluntarily, though voluntary here usually meant, "We'll give you a tiny slice of food and pretend it as a reward." There were escapes, quiet protests, and minor mutinies, all carefully documented in official histories with euphemisms. Disease ran rampant, small injuries festered, and exhaustion was endemic, but the bureaucracy maintained an impression of calm order. Laborers sang quietly, cursed softly, or carved symbols into bricks, small acts of resistance and self-expression that left traces for future archaeologists to interpret as either poetic or desperate. Let's float to the Ming Dynasty, which decided that the wall could use some upgrades, because clearly, 1,000 miles of stone was not enough. They rebuilt sections, reinforced walls, and added watchtowers at intervals that seem excessive if viewed purely for defense, but perfectly sensible if the goal is to overcomplicate logistics and mildly confuse laborers. The Ming engineers introduced uniform bricks, mortar, and slightly better planning, but terrain, human error, and climate still conspired to create stretches that looked elegant from a distance and slightly chaotic up close. Supervisors wrote glowing reports on efficiency, while laborers quietly rolled eyes that would never be recorded. And then there's the transportation of materials to the Ming walls. Timber, stones, and bricks had to reach sites over mountains, rivers, and deserts without modern vehicles. Workers used carts, sledges, and sheer muscle, often improvising methods that engineers would consider absurd today. Roads were built, repaired, and rebuilt constantly, often at laborer expense, because maintenance was deemed essential for imperial pride. Food convoys trailed these teams, providing meager sustenance, while laborers developed informal hierarchies, quietly rebelling with minor thefts, bribes, or clever misalignments of bricks. Human nature, it seems, has always found ways to complicate state projects. Meanwhile, small tragedies accumulated silently along the wall. People died from fatigue, exposure, or minor accidents, often with little acknowledgement beyond a brief note in a ledger. Funerals were sometimes conducted, sometimes skipped, because the pace of work rarely allowed for sentiment. And yet, despite all of this, construction continued with remarkable consistency, a strange combination of bureaucratic insistence and human perseverance. Each brick laid represents not only imperial ambition, but the stubbornness, endurance, and occasional misfortune of thousands of anonymous workers whose names history mostly forgot. Let's drift toward the logistics of supply once more, because it is fascinating in a quiet, almost absurd way. Food, water, and tools had to be delivered daily, often over impossible distances. Villages were stripped of resources, rivers navigated with precarious rafts, and carts pulled by oxen navigated narrow passes that threatened to collapse at every step. Supervisors monitored delivery, sometimes noting minor delays, while laborers endured the slow grind of hauling materials uphill, downstream, and across sand. Occasionally, entire convoys were lost to weather, accidents, or mismanagement, but replacements were sent immediately, because the empire demanded progress, and minor setbacks were only minor if ignored in official correspondence. Meanwhile, workers on distant sections created small cultural imprints on the wall. Names were inscribed in bricks, personal marks etched into stones, and small rituals performed for protection or luck. These acts were largely ignored at the time, but they provide a quiet reminder that even in one of history's most massive forced labor projects, humans find ways to leave personal traces. Supervisors probably sighed at these markings, noting them in reports as decorative irregularities, while laborers secretly smiled, proud of their small acts of rebellion. As the sun set over deserts, rivers, and mountains, the wall stretched endlessly, a slow, deliberate testimony to planning, patience, and mild obsession. Workers trudged home if lucky, or remained in camps if required by orders, their bodies aching, minds occupied with small frustrations, and spirits buoyed by occasional acts of quiet ingenuity. Supervisors wrote reports, soldiers kept watch, and the wall itself rose, section by section, slowly, inconsistently, yet remarkably enduring. And as night fell, lanterns glowed faintly in camps. Workers whispered stories about home, and the universe observed silently, indifferent to human effort, yet strangely rewarding persistence with the faint, enduring presence of stone upon stone upon stone. As we continue along the wall, let's pause at the watchtowers, those tiny stone boxes that look important from afar, but were mostly cramped, cold, and slightly uncomfortable in reality. Soldiers stationed here had to endure freezing winters, scorching summers, and the occasional boredom-induced existential crisis, all while keeping an eye out for invaders who, in some regions, were far too polite to show up. The towers were spaced so that smoke signals could be sent along the wall, which is charming, if you ignore the fact that wind, rain, and a slightly careless fire often rendered the system useless. Soldiers huddled together, sometimes sneezing from the cold, occasionally swearing under their breath, and always mildly aware that their job was mostly about looking vigilant while staying alive. Meanwhile, minor rebellions popped up from time to time, because human nature is persistent. Villagers occasionally refused to send sons, laborers slowed their pace deliberately, and convicts plotted quiet acts of sabotage, like misaligning stones or hiding tools. These rebellions were small, mostly ineffective, and sometimes ignored entirely in official records, which preferred to note that progress remained satisfactory. Supervisors naturally responded with stern warnings, occasional beatings, and a lot of paperwork, because bureaucracy was seen as the most reliable form of deterrence. Laborers, in turn, perfected subtle sarcasm, quietly mocking authority while completing their impossible tasks, leaving traces of human wit in an otherwise monumental project of stone and mortar. Winter added its own slow, quiet misery. Snow drifted across northern passes, freezing rivers and making paths slippery and treacherous. Workers had to carry stones that were heavier than usual because ice clung to them, adding extra kilograms to an already absurd burden. Fingers froze, lips cracked, and minor frostbite became routine. Supervisors bundled in furs occasionally issued orders, while soldiers stationed at watchtowers built small fires that did little to warm their toes. Tea and gruel were rationed carefully, mostly to prevent murmurs of rebellion, and those at the back of supply chains often went without. Yet construction continued, mile after mile, a quiet testament to endurance, stubbornness, and the Empire's impressive ability to ignore human suffering. And then there's the challenge of winter supplies, which was a nightmare in slow motion. Food, water, and tools had to reach remote sections of the wall over frozen rivers, snowed-in passes, and slippery slopes. Convoys often lost oxen to frost, sleds slid downhill, and minor avalanches delayed progress. Supervisors documented these as slight inconveniences, while laborers quietly cursed geography, bureaucracy, and occasionally fate itself. Despite these delays, the wall grew incrementally, each section a silent narrative of human determination, minor misery, and the absurdity of expecting perfection under impossible circumstances. Meanwhile, minor architectural quirks emerged, partly from improvisation and partly from exhaustion. Stones were sometimes uneven, bricks misaligned, and mortar inconsistent, creating a patchwork that modern eyes might call charming or chaotic. Engineers, far from present at every mile, accepted that uniformity was mostly aspirational. Laborers carved small marks into bricks, leaving personal signatures, graffiti, or little jokes, a subtle human touch amid monumental construction. Supervisors filed reports describing sections as structurally sound and visually consistent, which was technically true if one ignored slight deviations, minor cracks, and the occasional missing brick. Let's float to desert stretches again, where logistical challenges continued unabated. Sandstorms swept across work sites, obscuring paths, covering stones, and mildly irritating both laborers and supervisors. Water became even scarcer, so rations were rationed further, creating a quiet, persistent struggle against dehydration. The wall in these sections often rises and falls with the landscape, sometimes impressively steep, other times awkwardly sloped, a testament to the stubbornness of human labor, applied in nearly impossible circumstances. Workers muttered under their breath, cursed quietly, and sometimes sang songs of minor despair, small melodies that floated over the desert and eventually faded into historical obscurity. Meanwhile, coordination across regions remained absurdly complex. Sections built under different dynasties, using different materials, and staffed by different laborers had to be connected without falling apart entirely. Engineers measured distances with rudimentary tools, soldiers transported bricks and stones uphill, and supervisors wrote glowing reports that ignored minor inconsistencies. Laborers occasionally improvised, sometimes inventively, sometimes sloppily, creating small inconsistencies that would later intrigue historians and delight tourists. And yet, mile after mile, the wall advanced, not with elegance or speed, but with patient, deliberate, and slightly exasperated persistence. Back in mountain passes, construction continued despite minor tragedies. Accidents were frequent, some fatal, others merely inconvenient. Tools broke, ropes snapped, and stones slipped downhill, often narrowly missing someone, or, less frequently, taking a few unlucky laborers with them. Supervisors responded with mild annoyance, noting minor setbacks in reports, while laborers muttered faintly sarcastic prayers about the wisdom of imperial ambition. It is worth noting that these small calamities were not considered unusual. They were simply part of the rhythm of wall building, like rain on a roof or a particularly bad cup of tea. And then there are the supply chains that crisscrossed rivers and valleys. Food had to be transported to mountain camps, timber to remote sections, and bricks to deserts, all without modern vehicles. Convoys moved slowly, often impeded by snow, mud, or general human incompetence. Some were lost entirely, forcing replacements to be sent, because the empire demanded progress. Laborers ate meager rations, huddled in temporary shelters, and endured minor injuries, all while supervisors drafted reports describing a calm, orderly, and highly efficient operation. The contrast between reality and documentation is quietly hilarious if you imagine it from a human perspective. By midwinter, watchtowers, walls, and fortifications were all partially completed, partially destroyed, and partially in a state of ambiguous functionality. Soldiers stationed in northern posts endured isolation, cold, and boredom, occasionally marking small carvings on wooden beams to remind themselves that life continued. Laborers carried bricks with frozen hands, traveled over ice, and endured hunger quietly, as if patience were a form of defense against exhaustion. Supervisors occasionally visited, wrote glowing reports, and returned to more comfortable quarters, leaving behind the slightly chaotic but steadily progressing work. Finally, as the sun sets over distant mountains, deserts, and rivers, the wall stretches endlessly, a slow, relentless testament to human endurance, minor absurdities, and bureaucratic stubbornness. Workers return to temporary shelters, exhausted but alive. Soldiers huddle in towers, and the universe observes silently, indifferent to human labor. Supplies are rationed, tools are repaired, and bricks are stacked meticulously, often with small personal touches that humanize the monumental structure. And as night falls, lanterns flicker along camps, fires burn faintly, and the faint hum of human effort continues, a rhythm repeated across centuries, quietly absurd, quietly human, and quietly enduring. As the centuries rolled on, later dynasties decided that the wall needed embellishments, reinforcements, and watchtowers that were perhaps slightly excessive, because why not expand a project that already spanned thousands of miles? The Ming Dynasty, in particular, rebuilt and reinforced earlier sections, introducing uniform bricks, standard mortar, and slightly more organized labor. Of course, the mountains, deserts, and rivers had no concept of uniform, and so some sections ended up looking perfectly straight, while others zigzagged like a slightly confused dragon. Supervisors wrote reports describing everything as a model of imperial efficiency, while laborers quietly corrected mistakes with subtle sarcasm carved into bricks. Meanwhile, minor rebellions and escapes continued, because people never stopped finding ways to mildly complicate bureaucratic life. Laborers would pretend to be ill, hide tools, or misalign bricks, just enough to amuse themselves while staying within the limits of survivable punishment. Supervisors occasionally caught on, issued brief warnings, and mostly went back to sipping tea while the wall continued to grow, brick by brick, step by step, in a slow and persistent demonstration of human endurance. Across deserts, rivers, and hills, the rhythm of labor, supervision, and quiet rebellion created a strangely poetic chaos that modern visitors might describe as charmingly inconsistent, though those doing the work might have called it mildly exhausting. Winter remained a subtle antagonist, with frost and snow continuing to challenge construction. Workers trudged through icy passes, carrying stones heavier than their own bodies, while supervisors wrote reports emphasizing progress despite adverse weather. Food and water were rationed carefully. Fires burned faintly, and temporary shelters protected against wind, though not always against exhaustion. Occasionally, minor accidents slowed construction, and minor injuries became common. The laborers endured, sometimes singing quietly to pass time, sometimes muttering faintly sarcastic prayers, and always moving forward, because stopping was not an option, and quitting was even less of one. And then there's the absurdity of watchtower placement. Towers were positioned at intervals designed for communication via smoke signals, but in practice, wind, fog, and distance often made them slightly ineffective. Soldiers stationed there endured isolation, boredom, and minor frostbite, occasionally writing graffiti on beams to mark their presence. Some inscriptions were sarcastic, some devotional, and some gently absurd, offering a small glimpse into the human mind under monotonous conditions. Supervisors naturally documented watchtowers as operational, which technically was true if you ignored the human suffering and occasional lack of smoke signals. Let's float toward supply logistics, because this aspect alone deserves quiet reflection. Materials had to reach remote sections across mountains, rivers, and deserts without vehicles, cranes, or modern infrastructure. Convoys moved slowly, oxen often struggled, and minor accidents were frequent, ranging from overturned sleds to lost timber. Supervisors noted minor delays, laborers cursed quietly, and the wall continued to grow. Food, water, and tools were rationed carefully, but distribution was rarely perfect. Still, this imperfect process created the characteristic patchwork look of the wall, orderly in intent, mildly chaotic in execution, and quietly human in result. Meanwhile, in northern passes, laborers endured relentless cold while carrying heavy stones uphill. Fingers froze, toes numbed, and minor frostbite became a familiar companion. Soldiers huddled in watchtowers, often drinking warm tea and observing human endurance with mild amusement, while the wall itself continued to extend across terrain that no single human could truly dominate. Supervisors wrote glowing reports that ignored minor deaths, fainting, or malnutrition, ensuring that the official record remained calm, orderly, and impressively optimistic. Back in desert stretches, windstorms continued to challenge progress, shifting sand over recently completed sections and occasionally burying bricks entirely. Laborers had to clear paths, rebuild, and sometimes simply accept minor setbacks as part of life. Water was rationed, shade was rare, and small rebellions occasionally emerged, such as hiding bricks, misaligning stones, or subtly mocking supervisors. These acts were mostly ineffective, but provided a tiny spark of human resistance in the otherwise relentless grind of construction. Supervisors, unaware or politely ignoring such behavior, continued to draft reports emphasizing efficiency and diligence. And then there's the final absurdity. The wall was never really finished in the sense we might imagine. Sections required constant repair, watchtowers needed maintenance, and natural forces continued to erode the work of thousands of exhausted laborers. Minor disasters like floods, landslides, and earthquakes interrupted construction periodically, creating cycles of rebuilding, supervision, and minor human tragedy. Laborers developed ingenious ways to keep sections standing, often improvising with local materials, while supervisors maintained calm, glowing records of progress. The wall, in essence, became a living monument, a continuous effort that stretched beyond the lifespan of most individuals who contributed to it. Meanwhile, minor cultural imprints persisted. Laborers carved initials, symbols, and messages into bricks, leaving traces of humor, despair, and personal pride. Soldiers stationed in remote watchtowers marked dates, minor complaints, and faintly sarcastic remarks on wooden beams. Villagers living nearby occasionally left offerings, small signs, or prayers for protection, creating a subtle tapestry of human presence that endured alongside the wall itself. These minor touches humanize a structure otherwise defined by stone, mortar, and bureaucratic obsession, offering glimpses of life within what might otherwise be seen as relentless ambition. As the sun set over mountains, rivers, and deserts, the wall stretched like a faintly grumpy dragon, monumental, stubborn, and slightly irregular. Workers returned to temporary shelters, exhausted but alive. Soldiers huddled in watchtowers, noting the faint absurdity of their post. And supervisors returned to comfortable quarters, writing glowing reports that ignored minor deaths, injuries, and rebellions. Supplies were replenished, fires burned faintly, and the wall continued to grow. Slowly, unevenly, but relentlessly, a testament to endurance, bureaucratic stubbornness, and the quiet absurdity of human labor applied across centuries. Finally, as twilight descended and lanterns flickered along distant camps, the rhythm of human effort persisted. Laborers whispered stories of home, sang faintly, and endured fatigue with quiet dignity. Soldiers marked beams, recorded observations, and occasionally glanced at distant peaks, imagining the enormous scale of what they were a part of. And through it all, the wall itself persisted, a silent, enduring witness to the endless interplay of human perseverance, mild rebellion, and bureaucratic optimism. Its sheer length, irregularity, and persistence serve as a quiet reminder that even in the face of absurdity, humans continue to build, endure, and leave traces of their existence, one brick at a time. As we approach the final stretches of our journey along the Great Wall, let's float toward the stories of the people whose names are mostly forgotten, yet whose labor and endurance shaped this monumental structure. Laborers continued to haul stones across rugged terrain, enduring fatigue, cold, and occasional injury, while soldiers stationed in distant towers observed with mild boredom, sipping tea and marking small carvings on wooden beams. The rhythm of daily life was consistent, quiet, and occasionally absurd, punctuated only by the occasional minor rebellion or faint muttering of frustration that would never appear in official histories. Villagers near the wall lived with minor disruptions that persisted for generations. Crops were requisitioned, livestock conscripted, and sons drafted into labor teams for months or years at a time. They learned to tolerate, adapt, and occasionally protest in subtle ways, hiding tools, misaligning bricks, or leaving small sarcastic messages in mud or on stone. These acts were largely ineffective in halting construction, but they provided quiet satisfaction and a tiny spark of human autonomy amid relentless imperial ambition. Supervisors recorded progress, noting slight delays, which was the closest historical equivalent to a polite sigh. And then there were the winter hardships that persisted for centuries. Frost, snow, and ice challenged construction, slowed convoys, and added weight to already overburdened laborers. Fingers froze, toes numbed, and minor frostbite became a routine condition. Soldiers endured boredom and isolation in watchtowers, while laborers trudged uphill with stones, sometimes singing quietly or whispering stories of home to maintain morale. Tea, gruel, and meager rations provided limited comfort, while minor accidents and exhaustion accumulated quietly, leaving an unspoken narrative of persistence threaded through each section of the wall. Meanwhile, the desert stretches remained merciless. Windstorms buried partially built sections, shifted sand over bricks, and created obstacles that required ingenuity, patience, and occasional sarcasm to overcome. Water was scarce, heat was relentless, and workers learned to ration supplies creatively. Minor rebellions and acts of humor persisted, providing small relief from monotonous labor. Supervisors documented progress despite natural challenges, while laborers muttered faintly about the absurdity of building a wall that seemed endless, yet required constant attention, repair, and expansion. Across rivers and mountains, the wall continued to reflect the tension between ambition and human limitation. Engineers attempted consistency, soldiers maintained vigilance, and laborers carved small personal marks into stones and bricks. Some inscriptions were names, some were jokes, and some were subtle complaints about conditions, mortality, or the tediousness of bureaucracy. These minor imprints humanized the wall, giving it texture beyond stone and mortar, a quiet narrative of endurance, humor, and tiny resistance woven through centuries of construction. Minor tragedies also persisted quietly. Laborers occasionally died from accidents, exhaustion, or disease, and funerals were sometimes conducted, sometimes skipped in favor of continuing work. Supervisors rarely acknowledged these losses beyond brief mentions in reports, emphasizing efficiency and order. Yet human life, resilience, and ingenuity persisted in small ways. Improvised repairs, clever adjustments, and faintly sarcastic graffiti. These minor stories, mostly lost to history, provide the wall with a hidden life beyond bricks, mortar, and imperial ambition. As the Ming dynasty's work came to a close, maintenance became a constant necessity. Sections eroded, watchtowers decayed, and rivers gradually shifted. Laborers continued to repair, replace, and reinforce, often in conditions that were harsh and minimally rewarding. Soldiers maintained vigilance, occasionally amused by the absurdity of watching empty plains or mountains for invaders who rarely appeared. The rhythm of work, supervision, and minor rebellion persisted, creating a continuous, living narrative of human effort that spanned centuries and stretched across landscapes that seemed determined to resist construction at every step. And then there's the quiet humor hidden along the wall, names carved in bricks, faintly sarcastic inscriptions, small rituals of luck or protection, and whispered stories passed from laborer to laborer. Soldiers huddled in towers might have quietly appreciated these acts, understanding that human persistence always leaves subtle marks, even in the most massive and seemingly impersonal constructions. Supervisors, distant and comfortable, wrote reports describing calm progress, while the wall slowly, unevenly, and remarkably endured. Finally, as the sun sets and shadows stretch over mountains, deserts, and rivers, the Great Wall remains a testament to human endurance, ambition, and quiet absurdity. Laborers are long gone, soldiers have returned to the dust of history, and supervisors' reports remain faintly optimistic. Yet the wall persists, stretching over thousands of miles, uneven, patchy, and slightly crooked in places, bearing the traces of countless human lives, small triumphs, subtle rebellions, and enduring patience. It is less a perfect monument than a living record of human determination, bureaucratic stubbornness, and the quiet absurdity of massive projects undertaken with insufficient resources, but remarkable persistence. So as lanterns would have flickered in distant camps, fires burned faintly in shelters, and exhausted laborers finally rested, we too can drift away, carried by the slow, deliberate rhythm of history. The Great Wall, in its enduring majesty and imperfection, reminds us that human effort is never entirely orderly, rarely perfect, but often quietly beautiful in its persistence. And in this gentle reflection, we leave the wall behind, stone by stone, story by story, as the night settles across mountains, deserts, and rivers, carrying the memory of human endeavor into the calm embrace of history.